Good morning, guys, or whatever it is when you're watching this. So, welcome to Chapter 30. Chapter 30 is entitled Rebellion and Reaction, the 1960s and 1970s. So, in your book, you should be on about page 1122. Okay. All right. So, remember the Chapter 27, Chapter 28 tests will be our last regular type test. There will be a final exam. The final exam will be all essay choices. Okay, we've covered most of them so far. This chapter will cover 3 of the essay choices. So you go ahead and note those down now so you know what you're looking for. I'm not going to give you specific notes during the chapter like for objective questions. You just need to look for the topic. So one of your essay choices will be, basically there'll be 12 questions to choose from on the final exam. You have to answer 6. Okay, they each count 10 points each, so that's 60 points. So you get 40 points for your name. Okay, so make sure you put it on there and spell it correctly. 40 points for your name, so you have to answer 6 questions, and you may answer a 7th question, which means you could get up to 110 to 120 points. Remember, I even give extra credit on regular questions. So pretty much for those of you who struggle with objective questions, it should be a relief. It's all down to essay, but it means you got to give me some reasonable essays too, okay, if you expect to get a good grade. So fundamentally, this will be probably Wednesday, right before grades are due at South Plains, which should be somewhere around May 6th, I think, something like that. So somewhere around May 6th will be the final exam, which will be, again, just essays. So I will email you the choices, and then on your choice, either write it out on paper if you want to, use a Word document, send me the Word document, or use Google Docs. That's your choice as to how you do that. We'll talk more about it later. So there will be questions from stuff we already talked about. Basically, starting with chapter 29. It'll start with the Cuban Missile Crisis. That'll be your first question. So, and then we'll go through the chapter 30, chapter 31, and then chapter 32 as possible. If we don't get through the chapters, then obviously there'll be questions you just want to answer, okay? Anyway, so 3 questions from this chapter. So one is discuss the Vietnam War during the next administration. Make sure this is not Johnson. There's a separate question on the Vietnam War during the Johnson administration. There's a question on the Vietnam War during the Nixon administration. There's also a question on domestic affairs of the Nixon administration. It says, be sure to address stagflation. You may get some of that more out of chapter 31 and 30. And then the last one from this chapter, we discuss Watergate. So you're going to discuss Vietnam under Nixon, you're going to discuss domestic issues under Nixon, and you're going to discuss Watergate. And the last 3 questions will come from the following chapters. There'll be one on the Carter administration, making sure you discuss the Iran hostage crisis. There'll be one on the Reagan administration. There'll be one on the presidency of George H.W. Bush. And so those will be your choices, so you can prepare for those. All right, so we're on chapter 30, Rebellion and Reaction. So first section talks about Forever Young. Let's see if I can get this thing fired up and going. Of course, here. All right, we're working. We're not ever going to listen to that guy. All right, so the roots of rebellion. The youth revolt, okay, starts on page 1122. So that'll be part of the domestic issues under Nixon, okay? So remember, this goes back to the 60s. It goes back to Johnson's thing, obviously, marches, protests, all these things. So all the issues that have been associated with the civil rights movement in the 50s and beyond basically inspired other groups. One of those was women, but also Native Americans, Hispanics, gays, disabled, all wanted justice, freedom, and equality. And so during the mid-60s, they've already talked about, big full-time youth revolt occurred. Basically, there were 2 elements of the youth revolt, okay? 2, and they were different. They were overlapping, but they were different. The New Left and the counterculture. So let's talk about the New Left first. That was basically political, okay? And that originated when Tom Hayden and Alan Haber, who were 2 University of Michigan students, formed the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, college-based, campus-based thing, and influenced by what had happened in the civil rights movement. They primarily wanted to turn the United States into a more democratic society was the idea, okay? All right. Hayden wanted political reforms, racial equality, workers' rights. And so they adopted the term New Left. to make themselves different from the traditional grassroots democracy, the old left of the 30s. And so it grew pretty quickly, and there was over 1,000 campuses had chapters of the SDS. By 1965, we were heavily involved, really more 66, but by 65, involvement was growing, and so that was that affected the agenda of the rebellious students. Obviously, millions of young men were eligible for the draft. They were facing that process and fighting in a war that was becoming more and more unpopular. And as the book says, it was mostly a poor man's fight. If you were a college student, which meant more money, college students were able to defer draft until they received their degree, or they reached the age of 24 and hadn't done the degree. So as long as they were in college, full-time in college, and they weren't 24 yet, they were not ineligible. In 1965 to 66, only about 2% of those inducted into the military were college students. If you were African-American or Hispanic, you were twice as likely to be drafted as a white person. As the war went on, we talked in the last chapter about hawks and doves. Hawks supported the war, doves were opposed to it. Somewhere around 200,000 young men, we don't know the actual numbers, but somewhere around a couple 100,000 young men actually ignored their draft notices. About 4,000 actually served prison sentences because of that. Another 56,000 actually qualified under conscientious objector status. That would be like Jehovah's Witnesses. They can qualify as conscientious objectors. If you saw the movie Heartbreak Ridge, you saw about, you could be a conscientious objector and still serve. That's a great movie if you haven't seen that. Some, of course, just decided to zip off to Canada, hide in Canada, or Sweden, someplace like that, to avoid being drafted. The most popular means, of course, is an old traditional thing, which is try to figure out some way to flunk the physical. If you flunk the physical, well, then you're not qualified. Obviously, later in the 60s, 67, 68, the anti-war movement became even more violent. Inner city ghettos, Cleveland, Detroit, Newark, had lots of problems already because of racial issues, and that just fanned the flames. In fact, when I worked in Newark from 1982 to 1985, and there were still burned out buildings left in the 80s that had been burned out in the 1967 riots in Newark. In fact, we eventually turned one of those burned out buildings into a dormitory. And of course, you talk about 1968 already, the big deal about 1968. Remember Lyndon Johnson announced he would not run for presidency. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy were assassinated, and campus unrest just exploded. Student radicals became even more about being nice and decided they need to be tough. And so a lot of Americans, of course, are not happy with what they saw as a new left. All right, that's the new left. The other aspect, here's a picture. Doesn't look like too much rioting, does it? But anyway. All right, let's look at the counterculture. All right, so that was the other aspect of the youth rebellion. So most young Americans were not really all that political, okay? They weren't trying to get elected and elect the right people. They just wanted to change their lifestyles, okay? They weren't trying to change opinions. Basically, they were what was called the counterculture, the hippies were called that time. Basically, it was not, SDS was obviously organized, but the counterculture was not organized, it just kind of happened. Basically, it was a rebellion against mainstream institutions, values, and behavior. So it was more about cultural change than it really was about being politically active. They rejected money, so they rejected wealth and careers. It was all about just plain living, basically just freedom. But both the counterculture and the new left rejected the status quo. To most hippies, the issue was drop out, okay? Drop out of mainstream society trying to change things. The old drug thing was tune in, turn on, and drop out was the mantra. Make love, not war. That was the big idea. So they created their own subculture, not exactly the same as the Beats from the 50s, but similar to that idea, okay? So at the same time, they were defiant, innocent, egalitarian, optimistic, and indulgent, okay? And they rejected, as the book says, the nation's core institutions, family, government, corporations, and military, et cetera. Lots of different ideas. peace, love, harmony, rock music, mystical religions, mind-altering drugs, casual sex, communal living. Those are all aspects of the counterculture. And then lots of others you can probably think about too. Basically, hippie fashion, in order to not follow the standard stuff, you had to follow different standards. So long hair and different kind of clothing. Basically, beards were a big thing. Women were about, my grandson's over here looking at something, basically about not wearing makeup, not fixing their hair, stuff like that. Illegal drugs were a very common part of the counterculture. The counterculture sometimes included the idea of communes, okay, or intentional communities. Thousands of hippies went to the countryside to find places to live. But most of the communes did not last very long. That brings us to Woodstock, which is a big part of the counterculture. I think most people know about Woodstock. During the early 60s, Pete Seeger, Joan Baez, Peter Paul and Mary, Bob Dylan were some of those who produced songs that were intended to push for social reform. Within a few years, though, most of the hippies' favorite performers were under the influence of mind-altering drugs. Huge outdoor concerts were a big popular deal. The largest was the Woodstock Music and Art Affair in mid-August 1969. Over 400,000 young people, mostly young people, went to a 600-acre farm near Bethel, New York, what was called the world's largest happening for 3 days. Okay? And you can look up stuff on that. After 1969, the counterculture began to fade as more kids went more to the reality of other problems. But social activism spread, so it went to some other areas. That brings us to feminism, okay? So the same liberationist ideas that had been around before also led to other things. So the success of the civil rights movement led, women, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, gays, elderly, physically mentally disabled, I already mentioned that, to also look for equal opportunities and equal rights. The women's movement, if you remember going back to the late 19th and early 20th century, was mostly about getting the right to vote. That was women's suffrage. That was what it was all about. In the 60s and 70s of the 20th century, it became more about challenging the conventional idea of female domesticity, that basically women's place was in the home, okay? And they wanted to be treated equally in the workplace. But for most women in the early 60s, that really wasn't their goal. They just wanted to have a nice house and everything going on, okay? The big name in feminism is Betty Friedan, okay? I'm on page 1129 now. Betty Friedan, no test question of her. So she was a 42-year-old journalist, mother of three. She was from Peoria, Illinois, and she became the leader of the women's movement. She published a book in 1963 called The Feminine Mystique, and that became kind of the Bible of the women's movement. She basically felt that the problem for women was that the advertisers in women's magazine were trying to brainwash women into embracing the feminine mystique, she called it, of blissful domesticity, and where it was all about marriage and motherhood. Obviously, the feminine mystique was a key book in our history. It did change American society by, as some people said, defining a problem that has no name. In 1966, Friedan and other women founded the National Organization for Women, NOW, now. So they were trying to end gender discrimination in the workplace. Women should have equal pay for equal work. Women should have equal opportunity promotions, those things that weren't happening. And pushed efforts to legalize abortion, that's the unfortunate side of it, and get federal and state support for child care centers. So by the early 70s, Congress, the Supreme Court, and now we're all pushing the idea of gender equality. Title IX, you've probably heard the term Title IX before. Title IX, remember, a law, an act has sections to it. The sections are called titles. So Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 barred discrimination on the basis of sex in any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance, and pretty much just applied to athletics. So one of the impacts of Title IX, for example, is that if you have sports already established in a college, fine, the sports are already established, but in order to establish new sports, you can't add more sports for men without ensuring there's an equal number of sports for women. So the impact of that has been for schools who came late to the game on some sports and who have football. Football has pretty much killed most other men's sports. Texas Tech does not have a men's soccer team. Texas Tech does not have a men's lacrosse team. They have a women's soccer team. They have a women's lacrosse team. Now, they have men competing in club competition, but not in NCAA. That's because of how many hundreds of people are involved in the football program. And so that's why you see things like that. That's part of Title IX. I would say one of the things in kind of in danger in our current thing of saying you can be whatever gender you want to, that's creating lots of challenges. I think women are going to be the big sufferers for that. We already know that you have in high school athletics, you have boys claiming to be girls out there competing in track and places like that. So kind of attack on Title IX. Anyway, so basically, so Congress approved easily the Equal Rights Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which if ratified by states would have required equal treatment for women throughout society by politics. The way it was set up, it required, you remember, about 3/4 of states have to approve it. So for that 50, that would have been 38 states. By mid-1973, 28 states had approved, but they needed 38. And eventually time would run out on the Equal Rights Amendment. By 1973, that was another watershed time in history. The Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade decision, unfortunately, as Texans, we have to bear the brunt of Roe v. Wade, came out of Texas, okay? Roe referred, we already talked about this, Roe referred to a unnamed female. She didn't call herself Jane Doe, she called herself Jane Roe. Ms. Wade was the district attorney for the Dallas County, and that was who the suit was against. So Roe v. Wade, basically, the Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade struck down state laws that forbade abortions during the first 3 months of pregnancy. And basically, in Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court said women have a fundamental right to choose whether to bear a child or not, since pregnancy affected a woman's health and well-being. Obviously, we know that's wrong. You're killing a baby, that's not part of your body. So that brings us to more radical feminism. Here's a little flower power picture from the counterculture. And there's a picture of Betty Friedan. And there's a little demonstration. All right, so during the late 60s, a new wave of feminism arose. Younger, they were looking for women's liberation, women's lib from all sorts of sexism, what they also call male chauvinism or male oppression. The new feminists were called women's libbers, and they were much more militant than the people like Betty Friedan who'd established the beginnings of now. By the end of the 70s, there were lots of disputes between the more moderate feminists and the radical feminists that basically caused the women's movement to kind of fall apart in the same way that civil rights had kind of had issues as people split there. Basically, the women's movement was not able to get much, support much beyond the white middle class to support that. The Equal Rights Amendment by 1982 had died 3 states short of ratification. 35 out of 50 states ratified it, but it needed 38. Now, some people would argue that the reality was the Equal Rights Amendment would not have added anything to laws that were already in existence, just weren't being enforced. But the feminist movement did help women achieve mass entry into the labor market and work more and more in the direction of equal pay and equal treatment, although people would argue we're still not there, and that's probably true. And of course, as women became more involved in the workforce, they became more economically and politically influential as well. All right, that brings us on the slide to the sexual revolution and the pill, okay? So feminist movement also occurred along what was called the sexual revolution. Americans became more tolerant of premarital sex, and women became more sexually active. Part of this was the pill, okay? The birth control pill was approved by the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, in 1960, and that basically contributed to a rise in sexually transmitted diseases too. Many women viewed it as an inexpensive way to get better control of their bodies and futures. Hispanic rights is the next one. Obviously, student revolts, civil rights movement, women's rights, all those spread to ethnic minority groups as well. The word Hispanic is a reference to people tracing their ancestry to Spanish-speaking Latin America or Spain. After 1945 became more in use, along with efforts to push for economic and social justice. The term Latino is used sometimes as a synonym for Hispanic, but technically only refers to people from Latin America, would not refer to somebody from Spain or Europe. As with African Americans, the military, remember, we talked about the GI Forum. Basically, service in the military helped heighten sensitivity to inequality. But it was still tricky to get there. The interesting difference about Hispanic civil rights leaders is they had a couple issues to deal with. One was, of course, a massive number of undocumented immigrants flowing across the border in the United States. The many Mexican Americans, obviously, they were looking for economic opportunity, economic advancement, social equality, and so they were willing to come in and get low-paying jobs. Mexican American leaders also helped in the Bracero program in 1964. If you remember, the Bracero program was about bringing contract day laborers across the border. Interesting enough, I saw in the news last night, they were talking about that basically part of what's going on in the pandemic now is a recognition that we do need a lot of these immigrant workers to do things. All right, that brings us to Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers, okay? In the early 60s, Mexican American workers formed their own civil rights organization, United Farm Workers, UFW, founded by Cesar Chavez. In September 1965, they organized a strike against the corporate grape growers in California's San Joaquin Valley, and that got them national attention. The big strength of the Hispanic rights movement was not so much about sit-ins and protest marches, but the fact that the Hispanic population was rapidly growing in our country and giving them more voting power, and obviously being concentrated in some states gave them key electoral votes that would make a big difference. All right, that brings us to Native American rights. Native Americans, American Indians, in the 60s, 70s, it became a popular thing to use the term Native Americans. Now it's not so popular. Now we live in a day and age when most American Indians would prefer to be called American Indian than Native American. So in the 60s, they became a political force. There were two reasons why this happened. One was that obviously during this time of cultural and social sensitivity, a lot of whites had begun to recognize that what we'd done, after all, the Indians were here first, we came and took over their land, so there was some sensitivity to that. Also, things were really, really bad for Native Americans then. And Indian unemployment was 10 times the national average, and the suicide rate for Native Americans was 100 times higher than that of whites. Part of President Johnson's war on poverty was to try to get money to the reservations, but to a lot of the militants, that just wasn't happening fast enough. So to go along with Black Power, they promoted what was called Red Power, and they began to become organized. In 1968, two Chippewas living in Minneapolis, George Mitchell and Dennis Banks, founded the American Indian Movement, AIM, A-I-M. In 1973, AIM led 200 Sioux in South Dakota, the city of Wounded Knee. They occupied the city. Wounded Knee was where the U.S. 7th Cavalry had massacred a Sioux village in 1890. There was a big confrontation with government officials. It finally ended when the government said, "Hey, all right, we'll go back and look at Indian treaty rights." So Indian protesters also find a more effective way to work. They went into federal courts with copies of old treaties and said, "Hey, these treaties say that this land belongs to us. We want this land. If we can't have the land, we want some money for it." In Alaska, Maine, South Carolina, and Massachusetts, they actually won substantial settlements that recognized that they had tribal rights, and so they got monetary compensation for that. All right, that leads us to gay rights. Part of what came out of this was in homosexuals also trying to push for equal treatment. Obviously, before this time, homosexuality was basically illegal. It was recognized by the American psychiatric and psychologists as being a mental problem, but they wanted to change. Okay, gays basically pushed two groups. One was the Gay Liberation Front, and the other the Gay Activist Alliance, both of them about ending discrimination. By 1973, there were almost 800 gay organizations across the country, and that was the year that the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from their list of mental illnesses. And basically, but again, as in the other movements, they began to have some problems too. All right, that brings us to Nixon and the revival of conservatism. That's on page 1137 in your book. So that's would come back to domestic affairs during Nixon's reign. So this went back to what Richard Nixon said, hey, you know, all this stuff is going on, but the great silent majority of middle-class Americans are the ones who helped him win in 1968. And he was elected as a representative of middle America. People weren't all about all the liberal stuff and the hippies and their radical feminism and affirmative action programs. But there was a conservative backlash. If you remember, George Wallace, our infamous governor from Alabama, was a big leader of that. Big champion of states' rights primarily meaning supporting segregation, and the voice of white backlash against this. Wallace became the voice for a lot of middle-class whites who weren't necessarily racist, but they were fed up with some of the political liberalism and social radicalism. Richard Nixon appealed to the working and middle-class whites who were being corrupted, who were afraid that we were becoming more permissive and tyrannical in our society. Nixon was a sharp guy and determined to succeed in politics in 1968. He pledged to find the truth, to speak the truth, and live with the truth, or something reasonably close to that. Okay? Obviously, he didn't do that. All right, so let's look at some of Nixon's appointments. Okay, in his first term, in Nixon's cabinet and staff were only white men who were there to be yes men. As Secretary of State, Nixon chose William Rogers, who had been Attorney General under Dwight Eisenhower and therefore was an old friend of Nixon's from his vice presidential days. But Nixon was not going to make him the chief diplomat. So instead, he basically ignored Rogers essentially while he was in office and partnered with Dr. Henry Kissinger, who was a German-born Harvard political scientist who would become the nation's big foreign policy expert. In 1969, Nixon named Henry Kissinger as his national security advisor. And then finally, in 1973, Kissinger would actually become Secretary of State. All right, your slide says Southern strategy. That's the next thing on there. One of the reasons that Nixon won in 1968, was able to win again in 1972, was his so-called Southern strategy. The idea of winning over white Southern Democrats who have been not happy with civil rights revolution. Basically, for 100 years, whites in the solid South were basically solidly Democratic. They considered the Republican Party the party of the Union, the party of the North, the party of invasion. And so basically, in the late 60s and 70s, but things were starting to change. Rapid population growth had brought people from other parts of the country to the South, the Southwest, California, were able to pick up more and more congressional seats, more electoral votes. Everything was important. Every president elected between 1964 and 2008 had some sort of roots in the Sun Belt. Basically, Johnson was from Texas, and Nixon was from California, and Carter was from Georgia, and Reagan was from California, and George H.W. Bush had, lived and worked in in Texas for a long time, and Clinton was from Arkansas, and George W. Bush grew up in Texas. So basically all the Sun Belt. So lots of blue collar whites were also alienated by the Democratic Party, and what was happening in the North and the cities, lots of white backlash. In the 1968 presidential campaign, that allowed Nixon's Southern strategy to help him pick up a lot of traditional white Democratic voters. In the 1972 election, Nixon actually carried over every Southern state by big majorities. And so that became basically the Republican takeover. The book says the Republican takeover of the once solid Democratic South was the greatest realignment in American politics since Franklin D. Roosevelt's election in 1932. You guys have grown up with the idea that this is the South, this is West Texas, and we're Republican. We've always been Republican, but that's actually not true. Okay, that was a change from the early 70s. All right, that brings us to Nixon's domestic agenda, which he wasn't his big thing, okay? Um, like Johnson and Kennedy, Nixon was trying to increase the power of the presidency. They all believed that the presidency was the source of governmental action. Foreign policy should come from the White House, not the State Department, and the president could wage war if he needed to, okay? Not quite within the Constitution. Nixon's problem, though, was in spite of his big wins, Congress was still controlled by the Democrats, so he had to be careful. During his first term, he was trying to just develop policies and programs that would help him get reelected. 1972, a lot of presidents, that's what they're trying to do first time around. So to please the Republicans and get more conservative Democrats, he pushed what he called the new federalism. The idea was to send federal monies to state and local governments and then let them spend it how they wanted to. He also disbanded the Office of Economic Opportunity, which was a key part of Johnson's war on poverty, and cut funding to a number of Great Society programs. At the same time, the Democrats did pass a number of important laws that Nixon signed. One was the right of 18-year-olds to vote in national elections in 1970. And then finally, under the 26th Amendment in 1971, in all elections. So, and that was really a product of the Vietnam War. The idea being pushed that if you're old enough to go and fight and die for your country, you ought to be old enough to vote. That was the idea. I'm not totally comfortable with that, but I understand the concept. Social Security benefits were also went up along with food stamp funding. And then in 1970, OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, was passed and basically created the OSHA organization to ensure a safer workplace. And then the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971 changed the rules about how corporate money could be donated to political campaigns. During his first term, Nixon also tried to slow down the civil rights movement. And that brings us to Nixon environmental protection. Somebody's phone's going off. One of the big things that happened during the 70s was a dramatic increase in the price of oil and gasoline, and that created a major energy crisis. In 1970, Nixon, by executive order, not by Congress, created two new federal environmental agencies. This is the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, that we're familiar with, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and also signed the Clean Air Act. So that's under environmental protection. All right. All right, that brings us to stagflation. Okay, remember one of your essay choices on the final exam will be discussed domestic affairs in this administration. Be sure to address stagflation. All right, so that's on page 1142. The biggest domestic issue development during Nixon's time was the economy and its bad problems. And of course, we're in one of those now, generated by the pandemic. So between how much the Vietnam War cost and how much the Great Society programs cost, that basically quadrupled the annual inflation rate from 3% in 1967 to 12% in 1974. When I entered the Air Force in 1964, military pay had not changed since before World War I, and prices were fairly similar to what they've been for a long, long time. But all that started to change in the late 60s. Unemployment, which had been about 3.3% when Nixon entered office, nearly doubled to 6% by the end of 1970, within a year. Economists coined the term stagflation, basically to describe, you basically have two problems. You have a stagnant economy, that's stagnation, all right? But typically, if you have inflation occurs because the economy is growing, which means unemployment is going down, okay? That would be inflation. If the economy is not doing well, that's a period of stagnation. Normally, unemployment is high. And those are two counteractive ideas, contraindicated ideas. Well, interesting enough, we had a period of stalled economic growth, that's stagnation, at the same time that inflation was increasing and unemployment was increasing, which normally doesn't occur. Consumer prices grew rapidly with a rapidly growing economy and rising unemployment. Ordinarily, that's what happens. Ordinarily, economy is growing, employment's increasing, prices are going up. But now we have the reverse. And so we had an unusual combination of having a recession and inflation at the same time, which generally doesn't happen. And that was made worse in the 70s because of oil and gasoline becoming scarcer and more costly when the OPEC, there's another good one for you, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, lots of these Arab countries decided to use their oil supplies as a weapon. Okay? My grandson's unhappy about something. Okay. All right, 1973, the United States had sent massive aid to Israel after the Syrian-Egyptian attack launched on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. So basically, they attacked on a holiday, and that was an interesting time for me. I will tell you a little quick story there. So Yom Kippur, so 1973, Vietnam War is ending, and so instead of going to Vietnam as I expected from my flight instructor assignment in Del Rio, I ended up going to missiles. Okay, because the war was ending, they didn't need people. They didn't need pilots. Pilots are expensive to train, though. So what the Air Force did was get rid of lots of officers who were not pilots, and then put pilots into non-flying jobs so they could be pulled up later whenever they were needed to become pilots. And so there were 3 different phases of how quickly they could get you back in. So missiles was a 1-year program because it takes a long time to train your replacement. If you're like a supply officer, well, then they just need 90 days to stick somebody in officer training school and replace you. So basically, I went to missiles, and I went to training in California, Vandenberg Air Force Base in Lompoc, and then to Cheyenne, Wyoming. And so that was the summer of 1973. So that was the beginning of what was called the Minuteman III program. The missiles mostly operated Minuteman I. That was a single warhead. We went to the Minuteman III program, which was a multiple independently rechargeable vehicles. I don't know if he's happy or unhappy. Anyway, so basically it was a new system. And so I went through training in California, and then we went to, in September, got to Cheyenne and had to go through local training for about a month. And then you would certify you and your crew member, me and my deputy commander would go before the wing commander, and we would do a presentation of what we knew, and he would ask lots of questions. And then it was up to the wing commander to personally certify every nuclear launch crew, every missile combat crew. And so we were there. There were 6 of us in my class, plus a senior officer who was just there with us. And so 3 crews of 2. So the other 2 crews were going to the only operational squadron. My deputy and I would be the first people to go to the second squadron that was programmed to come up, hadn't come up yet. And so they didn't certify us quite as quickly as the other 4 guys. So one of the other crews, George and Joe, we'll just call them George and Joe, were already chosen for it. And George, I'll tell you, George Chaplin. George Chaplin was an older guy. He'd been a intelligence officer for the Air Force, and he was a little strange. His deputy commander was the first lieutenant, Joe Fauner, who lived down the street from me, and he was a young guy who'd been a missile maintenance officer, and then he became a launch officer. So they were out on alert. And so my deputy and I, we're still going through training. Anyway, so when Yom Kippur occurs, if you don't know anything, we show up at work to do another practice to get ready for our certification. We've been in formal full dress uniform and all that. And so we're there in our short sleeve blue shirts in no time. So we walk in, and somebody walks up to us and says, okay, we've called your wives, they're packing your bags, and you're going to certify in an hour before a squadron commander, not the wing commander. And so what happened is when Yom Kippur began, when the Syrian-Egyptian attack began, then we go into a higher DEFCON level, if you've heard that term before, Defense Condition 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's not particularly all that classified. So DEFCON 1 is the highest, and DEFCON 5 is the lowest. And in DEFCON 1, there's actually 8 what are called postures that can be. So basically, a normal day-to-day operation in the world is DEFCON 5. Missiles always operated on DEFCON 4 because we could get to war faster anyway. So what had happened is we had gone to a higher DEFCON. I can't remember if DEFCON 3 or DEFCON 2. So part of this was to get ready, but they were planning for, so we were DEFCON 3. they were planning for DEFCON 2. Under DEFCON 2, they had training sites in California. They actually would have put a nuclear warhead on the training missiles in California and sent a crew. So the plan was, since my deputy and I were not certified yet, and therefore we're not on the schedule, then they didn't have to put anybody to the schedule. They were going to certify us and send us out to California to pull alert at road. So that's why our bags were supposed to be packed by our wives. They were going to certify us, and they could, in an hour or two, they could send us. Of course, my deputy got strangely excited because he wanted to go play golf in California. At any rate, so that was kind of where we were headed. At the same time, this is going, while this happened, so George and Joe, they were out actually on alert. Actually, I think maybe their very first alert, they were out there. And so when the message rings, the alert signal goes, and they get a message. And of course, that's, we practiced 6-hour training sessions where we worked on maintenance for 4 hours, and we went to war for an hour, hour and a half. And so they were getting the signals. They got the message, and the message that sent them to DEFCON 3. And so that raised attention. So George, he's older, he's okay, but Joe, he's young, he's excited. So things are kind of a little tense there because this is not what we're expecting to happen. So they decode the message. They know they're at DEFCON 3. They have some steps to go through. So you have to picture the capsule, the alert capsule, 60 feet underground. It literally is a capsule hanging from the ceiling, and so that you can absorb shocks. And so the bathroom is actually just a corner over there, and there's just a toilet stool over there in the corner. And then there's actually, if you, like in a hospital room, you have a curtain you can pull around you, which in technical terms was called the acoustical enclosure. And so the interesting thing is so by that corner, we're also a couple with the light switches, and also a couple manual valves to do the basically a shut-off valve to close down in case of war. We want to shut the capsule off entirely, so we weren't getting air or water, or whatever sewage stuff going upstairs, so you could shut that off. So when we went through our training sessions, part of the indication of going to war was to indicate that you were getting nuclear hits, commercial power was destroyed, so the lights would go out, you get signals, and at some point in time, somebody would slam the wall indicating that the shutoff valve had closed. So George goes over there, closes the acoustical curtain, and while he's in there, he shuts off the lights and hits the shutoff valve, and so the lights go out, and we don't want to know what happened to Joe, but that was pretty scary for him. So anyways, that was my little Yom Kippur War story. So back to the book, okay? So basically, the United States sent massive aid to Israel after that. OPEC's response was not to sell oil to nations who support Israel and raised their prices by 400%. And so what was called the Arab oil embargo, I think somebody's doing a report on this, that caused gasoline shortages and skyrocketing prices. People lined up to get gasoline. Another condition that was part of stagflation was lots of new workers, okay? Remember the baby boom. So now in the 70s, we got lots of workers from the baby boom. From 1965 to 1980, workforce increased by about almost 30 million, basically more people than the entire workforce of France and West Germany put together. And obviously the number of new jobs couldn't keep up with the growth of the workforce, so lots of people were unemployed. So Nixon administration did a few things, but not very well. He did try to help things out there, but not too much. All right, that brings us to Vietnam, Nixon and Vietnam. Remember, another question is discuss the Vietnam War during the Nixon administration. So basically, turn to page 1144. Gradual withdrawal on your slide there, okay? So basically, there were three primary fronts, as the book says, that the Kissinger and Nixon Vietnam policy operated under. The first was we were still trying to negotiate in Paris with the North Vietnamese. So our negotiators pushed for withdrawal of Viet Cong from the South Vietnam, and that the backing of the U.S.-backed government of President Nguyen Van Thu. The North Vietnamese, of course, and Viet Cong negotiators, they, there he goes again. Basically, they wanted, of course, didn't want that. They wanted to keep communist military presence in the South, and their final goal was to reunite Vietnam into one country. So that was a negotiation front. The second front, Nixon was trying to deal with all the anti-war sentiment. So he was trying to reduce the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam, what was called Vietnamization, the idea of equipping and training more and more South Vietnamese soldiers and pilots to take over conflict as the Americans were reduced, which is against what led, as I said, to being in missiles in the first place. In 1969, that was the peak of our involvement. There were 560,000 troops in January 1969, so I'll get it yet. By 1973, we were down to 50,000 soldiers, and I was off in missiles. Also in 1969, Nixon established a draft lottery, okay? So basically a lottery system, which basically eliminated a lot of inequalities. And then in 1973, finally did away with the draft altogether and created all voluntary military. So between those and the troop patrols, anti-war movement kind of died. On the third front, Nixon and Kissinger basically expanded the bombing of North Vietnam, entertainment in the back there. Basically expanded the bombing of North Vietnam, hoping to put pressure on the communists to end the war. March 1969, we began a 14-month-long bombing campaign in Cambodia, neighboring country to Vietnam, which had been used as a base for lots of raids in South Vietnam. On April 30th, 1970, Nixon announced what he called an incursion into neutral Cambodia to clean out hidden communist military bases. Obviously, he knew that would kick the anti-war movement back up again, and it did. Just as he expected, the invasion of Cambodia, the increase of air war in Vietnam, spread more anti-war demonstrations. In the spring of 1970, the news of that reached off, lots of demonstrations at Kent State University. That's a picture. Kent State University, the Ohio National Guard was called in to take care of the rioting on May 4th. The radicals were throwing rocks and stuff like that, the soldiers. And of course, these are not really soldiers, they're civilians. People talk about military killing civilians. I would say these are civilians in uniform, killing civilians out of uniform. So young, not very well trained National Guardsmen, somebody panicked, opened fire. 13 students were shot, 4 of them died. Basically that spring, there were demonstrations on over 350 campuses. Basically not pleasant. Okay. In June 1971, the New York Times started publishing excerpts from something called the History of the U.S. Decision-Making Process of Vietnam Policy. It was a secret Defense Department study that Robert McNamara commissioned when he was Secretary of Defense before he resigned in 1968. Those were called the Pentagon Papers, and they were released to the press by Daniel Ellsberg, and there's a movie about that. He was a former Defense Department official, and he basically leaked the information. And so that confirmed that basically public had not always got the story. All right, War Without End, that's on your slide there. The summer 1972, Henry Kissinger was doing private meetings with the North Vietnamese negotiators in Paris, and he stopped insisting that all North Vietnamese troops be removed from South Vietnam before we withdrew. So he backed off. Peace talks broke off on December 16th, and so 2 days later, Nixon ordered more bombings of Hanoi, Haiphong, the 2 largest cities in North Vietnam. So pretty soon they got back to the peace table. On January 27th, 1973, United States, North and South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong signed an agreement to end the war and restore peace in Vietnam, what were known as the Paris Peace Accords. Basically, it was a surrender. Fighting again soon broke out in Vietnam and Cambodia. All right, that's the collapse of South Vietnam. That's the next thing on your slide there. Basically, on March 29th, 1973, a flask U.S. combat troops left Vietnam. That same day, around 600 American prisoners of war, almost all pilots, were released from Hanoi. Within a few months, the ceasefire fell apart, though. War between North and South Vietnam resumed, and communist forces without our help started gaining the upper hand. In Cambodia, which in 1970, after a military coup was renamed the Khmer Republic, and Laos, also was starting to fall to the communists as well. 1975, North Vietnamese launched a full-scale invasion of South Vietnam, and basically, obviously, the South fell. Basically, the negotiated settlement had given the United States enough time to get themselves out before the government fell apart. On April 30th, 1975, we watched on television as North Vietnamese tanks rolled into South Saigon, which was renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and military helicopters tried to get as many people out of the embassy as we could. For the baby boomers, the Vietnam War is a defining life event. Lots of baby boomers served, lots of baby boomers protested. Baby boomers were most of the U.S. troops as well as most of the protesters. Controversial war that would divide those. Vietnam combat veterans had lost a war in which the country lost interest. When they returned, there were no parades, and there was no welcome greetings. Lots of families didn't want to talk about what they'd done, and a lot of veterans were embarrassed about what they did. Unfairly, but that was that kind of war. We live in a time now when lots more recognition is being given to Vietnam veterans. Vietnam War, which was supposed to have been a crusade for democratic ideals, proved that we really couldn't do that as we would like to have done. All right, the Nixon Doctrine. Again, we're on page 1150 in the book. We're getting there, guys. Okay, we're getting close to the end. This is long, but you can take breaks whenever you want to, right? All right, Nixon Doctrine. Okay, Nixon was, biggest thing really was he considered himself an expert in foreign affairs. As vice president of Eisenhower, he traveled extensively to foreign countries, knew lots of people, had lots of involvement in the 50s. And of course, he benefited from having Henry Kissinger there. So their big design for foreign policy after Vietnam was to work on getting friendlier relationships with the Soviets and Communist China. They pushed for a return to the Eisenhower approach that was basically about not doing large-scale military interventions, but using the Central Intelligence Agency to push things. In July 1969, President Nixon unveiled what became to be known as the Nixon Doctrine. Basically, Nixon said, America cannot and will not conceive all the plans, design all the programs, execute all the decisions, and undertake all the defense of the free nations of the world. And so part of his plan was to be partnered with communist countries. That brings us to China, the People's Republic of China. Richard Nixon, as the book said, had a genius for surprise. In 1971, without telling his Secretary of State, William Rogers, remember he relied on Kissinger, not Rogers, he sent Kissinger on a secret trip to Beijing to look at the possibilities of recognizing Communist China. Remember, for decades, approach had been we recognize nationalist China, which was now in Taiwan, and not Communist China. So that had been true since 1949 when Mao Zedong's communist government had taken over. We refused to recognize him. So by now, both the United States and China were tired of this, and they were also concerned about Soviet expansionism. Remember, the Soviets are north of China, so they're a threat there. So July 15th, 1971, Nixon made his announcement surprising people that Kissinger had just returned from Beijing and that the president himself was going to be going to China in 1972. That shocked a lot of people. Nixon will become the first U.S. president to actually use the term People's Republic of China, symbolic of the change in relations. The nationalist Chinese, obviously on Taiwan, felt betrayed, and the Japanese also were angry too, because they felt that we were their defense against the Communist China. In October 1971, the United Nations voted to admit the People's Republic of China and kick out Taiwan. So in 1972, Nixon goes to China. He's there for a week, and part of that was scientific and cultural exchanges and discussions about resuming trade and the eventual reunification of Taiwan with the mainland. Obviously, Nixon had been elected as a conservative anti-communist. Basically, he had accomplished something that his Democratic predecessors could not have attempted because they'd be branded as soft on communism. Obviously, Nixon was not soft on communism, so they were able to get by with it, and that gave them leverage against the Soviet Union, who obviously, as the book says, were nervous about the possibilities of U.S.-China alliance. All right, that brings us to détente and the Soviet Union. So the United States beginning relationships with China, obviously created tensions in the Soviet Union. And so again, big surprise, President Nixon announces he's going to visit Moscow in 1972 to discuss things with Leonid Brezhnev, who's the Soviet premier. That was what came to be known as détente with the Soviets. Détente means easing or relaxing tensions. So the idea was to have less competition between the superpowers. Nixon and Brezhnev signed the SALT Treaty, later called SALT I, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, in which basically people have been working on since 1969. It did not end the nuclear arms race, but it did limit the number of missiles with nuclear warheads and prohibited anti-missile defense systems. So a big change in the world order because of what Nixon and Kissinger had done over time. Détente would help in the Cold War. Obviously, that's Reagan gets credit for that, but a lot of it goes back to Nixon. Okay, so it was a big important step before things got bad. The Middle East, there's Nixon in China. All right, the Middle East, that brings us shuttle diplomacy. The Middle East was still a problem on October 6, 1973. Remember Yom Kippur, Syria and Egypt, where he talked about that, backed by Saudi Arabia and using Soviet weapons to attack Israel, and that was the Yom Kippur War. Kissinger was able to get involved there, negotiate a ceasefire agreement, and put pressure on the Israelis from taking any more Arab territory. That brings us to the big deal, Watergate, okay? All right, so remember there is a choice on the final exam of discuss Watergate, okay? So that's kind of wide open, all right? All right, so Watergate, and that will finish up this chapter. Okay, so Nixon's successes in the foreign policy area allowed him to just turn the election 72 into just big triumphal march. Early on, his main threat had been George Wallace as a potential third-party candidate, and it was possible that George Wallace could have pulled a lot of conservative white Southern votes from the Republican Party and given the election to the Democrats. But on May 15, 1972, there was an attempted assassination on George Wallace. He survived, but he was paralyzed below the waist, and he had to pull out of the campaign. At the same time, the Democrats had chosen Senator George McGovern of South Dakota, again, popping up again, anti-war liberal, and he never had a chance either because the war was no longer an issue. So Nixon won the greatest victory of any Republican presidential candidate in history. I remember Johnson, Roosevelt, some people like that had won big time for the Democrats. Popular vote was 60.8%. Remember, Johnson's in 1964 was 61.1%, so almost that high. 486 million to 28 million, again, only second to Johnson's victory. But in spite of all his accomplishments, Nixon's personality was about being paranoid and insecure. So by the spring of 1972, when the election's rolling down, even though it's going to be a big victory, they don't know that. One of Nixon's senior aides was John Ehrlichman. He was in charge of a secret team of agents who did lots of sabotage against the Democrats. Things the book says, like falsely accusing Hubert Humphrey and Henry Jackson of sexual improprieties, forging press releases, setting off stink bombs at Democratic campaign events, and planting spies on George McGovern's campaign plan. During the campaign, McGovern complained about the dirty tricks, but pretty much it was ignored. Nixon, as it turned out, had ordered illegal wiretaps on his opponents, as well as his allies. He, as the book says, tried to coerce Internal Revenue Service to intimidate Democrats. He told his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, to break into the Brookings Institution in a Democratic research center. McGovern was particularly upset by what happened on June 17, 1972. 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate apartment and office complex in Washington, D.C. The burglars were former CIA agents, and one of those had actually worked on Nixon's campaign. Nixon said, "Oh, it's very bizarre. I had nothing to do with it." And the chances are he probably did not know in advance what was happening, but he and his aides began to cover up the Watergate affair. They actually provided $400,000 to the jailed burglars to buy their silence, and they tried to keep the FBI out of the investigation. During the trial, this is uncovering the cover-up on page 1156 on your slide there. The Watergate burglars came to trial in January 1973. Federal Judge John Sirica was the one who led the questioning, and basically, before it was done, one of the accused actually told what happened. James McCord was security chief of the committee to reelect the president. Now, here's this humor, strange humor. So the committee to reelect the president was called CREEP, CREEP. Was crazy, okay? He was one of the first who would actually begin to inform. Trail of evidence, Sirica went after the grand jury. Then a Senate committee headed by Democratic Senator Samuel J. Ervin, Sam Ervin in North Carolina. Sam Ervin always put on the airs about, I'm just a country lawyer from North Carolina. He was also a Harvard honor graduate. But anyway, so that led to White House legal counsel John Dean, what he called a cancer close to the presidency, that Nixon was involved in cover-up. He used his power to discredit and block the investigation. He ordered the CIA to keep the FBI off the case, and he even told his some of his aides how to lie under oath. Cover-up fell apart. Nixon basically told the public, I am not a crook, you know. And then Dean, who Nixon had fired because he was working with the prosecutors, also testified that there had been a cover-up approved by the president. So Nixon now became involved with legal self-defense, political survival. He refused to give the Ervin's committee the documents they asked for, citing executive privilege, which is used a lot and is valid a lot of times to protect national security. Another White House aide revealed that Nixon had a secret taping system in the White House, not the first president to do that, and lots of conversations about the government, about the Watergate burglary and cover-up have been recorded. So that was what was called the Nixon tapes. And so people started looking for that. Archibald Cox was a special investigator, special prosecutor. He actually took the president to court in October 1973 to get the tapes. Nixon refused again and ordered Cox fired. On October 20th, what was called the Saturday Night Massacre, Richardson and Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus resigned rather than fire Cox. Basically, lots of people, media, political people started calling for the president to be impeached for obstructing justice. A Gallup poll, Nixon's approval rating had gone down to 17%, the lowest at level any approval rating any president had ever received at that time. March 1974, a grand jury actually indicted Ehrlichman, Haldeman, and former Attorney General John Mitchell for obstruction of justice, and Nixon was named as an unindicted co-conspirator. On April 30th, Nixon still refusing to turn over the actual tapes, but he does release, and I have this, and if we were in school, I would pass it around to you, 1,254 pages of transcribed recordings that had been edited by Nixon. In a lot of cases, the term explicit deleted was put in there for bad language and for anti-Semitic terms. One of the shocks to American people was just how much bad language went on in the White House. So it didn't necessarily convict him or anything, but it revealed that there was lots of things that went on in the White House that we would not consider presidential. Summer 1972, Nixon is hounded and in retreat. The book says Americans watched the Ervin committee hearings as if they were a soap opera. On July 24th, 1974, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in United States versus Richard M. Nixon that the president had to surrender all the tape recordings. A few days after that, the House Judiciary Committee voted to recommend 3 articles of impeachment. 3 articles: obstruction of justice because of payment of hush money to witnesses and the withholding of evidence, abuse of power because of using federal agencies to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights, and the defiance of Congress by withholding the tapes. So that was the Judiciary Committee. And the way the process is, so the House Judiciary Committee suggests articles of impeachment. You guys know, we just went through this. Those go to the full House. The House votes. If they vote to impeach, then it goes to a trial. The trial is in the Senate, conducted by the House. But before that happened, so before the House could actually vote on impeachment, so technically Nixon was not impeached, Nixon handed over the White House tapes. But then once they got the tapes, the investigators learned that some of the recordings were missing, okay? the 18 minutes of a conversation in June 1972 that where Nixon first mentioned the Watergate burglary was gone. Nixon's secretary said, "Oh, it was me. I'm sorry, I accidentally erased it." She had accidentally pushed the wrong button, but technical experts later confirmed that no, they were intentionally deleted. Other recordings provide more than enough evidence anyway. The recordings led Republican leaders, including George H.W. Bush, who at this point in time, George H.W. Bush was the chairman of the Republican National Committee, urged Nixon to quit rather than facing impeachment. So on August 9th, 1974, President Nixon resigned from office, the only president to resign from office. The book says Nixon was one of the strangest, most complicated, most interesting political figures in history. He never understood why Watergate should end his presidency. His view was his only mistake was getting caught, okay? And he claimed that a president's actions could not be illegal. And of course, that's what a lot of his aides believe. They really, honestly, a lot of them believed if they were working for the president, whatever the president asked them to do was legal. There was no way it could be illegal. And so obviously he was wrong. And Watergate's affair is, again, a lesson in the president's not above the law. As a result of that, Congress passed several pieces of legislation to try to hold down executive power. They passed the War Powers Act in 1973, which requires a president to inform Congress within 48 hours if U.S. troops are deployed. Doesn't keep the commander-in-chief from deploying troops, but he's got to report it to Congress. And if Congress doesn't approve them staying, then 60 days later, he's got to pull them out. Congress also went back to the 1966 Freedom of Information Act and strengthened that to require, if the government's asked for responses, they got to give it to them. All right. That leads us to an unelected president, page 1159. We're almost there, guys. So during Richard Nixon's last year in office, obviously everything's about Watergate. And so not much happened in major foreign or domestic issues. October 1973, Vice President Spiro Agnew had been forced to resign because he was being charged with accepting bribes from contractors when he was the governor of Maryland and when he was vice president. So the vice president at the time of Nixon's resignation was Gerald Ford, okay? He was the House Minority Leader from Michigan that Nixon had appointed to succeed Agnew. If you remember, we talked about this, you go back and look in history, every time a vice president is taken over as president, there is no vice president because the Constitution made no provisions for providing for a vice presidency. But the 25th Amendment had fixed that. And under the 25th Amendment, if the office of vice president was vacated, then the president could recommend an appointment to Congress, and Congress would approve that. And so part of choosing Ford was he was very popular with Democrats and Republicans. So on August 9th, 1974, Ford was sworn in as the nation's first politically appointed chief executive, not elected. The only person in history to serve as both vice president and president without having been elected to either office. A month after taking office, Ford gives Nixon a full, free, and absolute pardon, okay? A lot of Americans weren't happy about that, lots of controversy. House was upset about that. They want to know whether Nixon had made a secret deal. Ford said no, but it would be a big downside on his presidency. Again, back to a personal note, I was one of those people upset. We just come out of Vietnam when we had the My Lai massacre with William Calley, when he obviously was wrong with his troops to kill those civilians, but he was the only one that got punished. His platoon commander was not punished. His regimental commander was not punished. There was an incident with a ship in the Pacific where the captain of the ship was punished, but nobody else was punished. And here we had all these aides of Nixon that were going to prison, but Nixon was not punished. And so it kind of affected my thinking, lots of people thinking that this really was unfair. He should be punished. Now, in retrospect, you get older, you get wiser, at least you hope you do. And one of the things I figured out later was that Ford did the right thing. Ford's idea was the country did not need to have a former president on trial kind of being the center of attention. And so he made the right decision, but as a 28, 29-year-old, I didn't see things that way. But later on, I learned to see the wisdom of his choice. All right. So as President, Gerald Ford basically essentially was about believing that the federal government had too much power. During his first 15 months as president, he vetoed 39 bills passed by Congress, basically trying to control things. He also appointed a vice president. He appointed Nelson Rockefeller, governor of New York. And so now we had a president and a vice president, neither of whom had been elected. Biggest problem in for a brief time was he's still dealing with the economy. Remember, the economy was in trouble. We're still in stagflation. By the fall of 1974, we were in the deepest recession since the Great Depression. Unemployment went from 9% in 1975 into double digits, and record federal deficit. That brings us to election 1976. When the 1976 election rolls around, both parties are kind of messed up. At the Republican convention, there was a challenge from a former two-term California governor by the name of Ronald Reagan, who was heading the growing conservative wing. He was able to stop that from happening. The Democrats chose James Earl Carter Jr., a one-term governor of Georgia, a former naval officer and nuclear engineer, turned peanut farmer because his father had died, and so he was forced to resign from the Navy and go back. He was one of Admiral Hyman Rickover's fair-haired boys in the nuclear submarine service, Annapolis graduate, the only Naval Academy graduate president, and one of several Southern Democrat governors who were trying to create the New South, move away for the Democratic Party from tax and spend liberalism, more moderate. Carter was able to leap on the bandwagon of cynicism and criticism after Watergate and promised that he would never tell a lie to the American people. And he also pushed the idea of, yes, you're right, I'm just a governor. I'm an outsider. I'm not part of all this bad stuff that goes on in Washington, D.C. He also pushed the idea that he was a Southern Baptist who was a born-again Christian. That was a new idea. And to the surprise of many, Carter was actually able to get Southern whites and Southern blacks, urban labor unionists from the North, and ethnic groups like Jews and Hispanics to vote for it. Barely, though, 41 million votes to Ford's 39 million votes. Big turnout of African Americans in the South that helped Carter win every state in the South except Virginia. He also benefited from his running mate, was Walter Mondale, who was a liberal running mate. Remember, Carter was moderate, a liberal running mate who was popular among blue-collar workers urban poor. Big thing was low voter turnout. Did not look good for the Democratic president. Last good story, personal story here. So the 1976 election was the only election in which I actually decided in the voting booth who to vote for. I did not know who I was going to vote for. I was battling between voting for Ford or Carter. I wasn't sure. I still had some lingering things about Ford pardoning Nixon. I wasn't happy about that. I didn't like some of the things being said against both candidates. I thought criticisms of Ford and criticisms of Carter were misdirected. And so last minute decision, I walked in. So in the voting booth, I decided who to vote for. As soon as I walked out, I thought, oh, maybe I should have voted for the other person. So I'm pretty unsure about that. All right, that is chapter 30. So next time we throw this together, it'll be chapter 31. We'll get into some of the other questions. If we don't get those things done, then we won't get that. So basically, however many stops you have to take, make sure you take good notes, and we'll talk to you later.